I always knew I was second best, though I never wanted to believe it. Growing up, my parents made it clear who the star of the family was. Ryan, my younger brother, was the golden child. It wasn't just subtle favoritism, it was blatant and unrelenting. While I worked hard to achieve good grades, excel in extracurriculars, and earn the respect of my teachers, Ryan would charm his way out of trouble and get applauded for mediocre accomplishments. My parents showered him with praise for things as trivial as participating in a school play, while my achievements were often met with a distracted, "That's nice, Ethan." Ryan's golden status was evident from the earliest days. At every school award ceremony, I would look out into the crowd, hoping to see pride in their faces when my name was called. Instead, their attention was always on Ryan, who would be waiting to perform his latest charm offensive on whoever would listen. He was their perfect child, their prince, as they jokingly call him. At home, I felt like a shadow, an afterthought. It didn't matter that I stayed up late studying or volunteered at the local shelter, my efforts were invisible compared to Ryan's bare minimum. When I turned 16, I got my first job to save up for a car. I worked weekends at a local diner, flipping burgers and cleaning tables. Meanwhile, Ryan received a brand new sedan for his birthday without lifting a finger. "Ryan deserves it," my mother had said. "He's got so much going on with school." The irony wasn't lost on me. Ryan's grades were mediocre at best, while I was pulling straight A's. It was a familiar narrative. Ryan's needs always came first. By the time I graduated high school, I had resigned myself to the fact that I was on my own. College was my chance to escape the suffocating comparisons. I worked tirelessly to secure scholarships and juggled 2 part-time jobs to cover the rest of my tuition. It wasn't easy, but it felt good to rely on myself. Ryan, on the other hand, coasted through life with my parents footing the bill for everything. He went to an expensive university, spent semesters abroad, and never had to worry about money. The disparity was glaring, but I told myself it didn't matter. I was building something of my own. Everything changed when I met Emily. She was a breath of fresh air, kind, intelligent, and driven. For the first time, I felt truly seen. Emily supported me in ways my family never had, encouraging my ambitions and celebrating my successes. We fell in love quickly and got engaged after 3 years of dating. For a moment, I thought I'd finally found my own happiness, separate from my family's shadow. But Ryan had a way of taking what wasn't his. At family gatherings, he would charm Emily with jokes and compliments. I didn't think much of it at first. Ryan had always been a flirt. Emily reassured me it was harmless, and I wanted to believe her. But cracks began to show. She started staying out late, avoiding my questions with vague excuses. My trust in her began to erode. The truth came out in the most devastating way. Emily tearfully confessed she was pregnant, and the baby wasn't mine. My world collapsed in an instant. She admitted to having an affair with Ryan, my own brother, 4 months. The betrayal was incomprehensible. I confronted my parents, hoping for support, but their reaction was a cruel reminder of my place in the family. "Ryan made a mistake," my mother said dismissively. "We all make mistakes. Don't throw away your family over this." My father added, "You need to look at the bigger picture, Ethan. Maybe you weren't giving Emily what she needed." Their words felt like knives. Not only had they excused Ryan's actions, but they'd also managed to shift the blame onto me. That was the breaking point. I packed my things, walked out the door, and vowed never to look back. The years that followed were a mix of struggle and triumph. I threw myself into my career, landing a job at a cybersecurity startup. The work was challenging, but it gave me purpose. Slowly, I built a life for myself, free from the toxic ties of my family. I rented a small apartment, then saved enough to buy a house. For the first time, I felt in control of my destiny. Meanwhile, Ryan's life unraveled. He dropped out of med school, failed at multiple business ventures, and burned through my parents' savings. Emily left him not long after their child was born, fed up with his irresponsibility. My parents continued to enable him, draining their retirement fund to bail him out time and again. Each failure brought them closer to financial ruin. For years after I walked away, my mother reached out. Her email was long and filled with apologies and pleas for help. She detailed their dire situation. Ryan was jobless, my father's health was failing, and they were drowning in debt. "We need you, Ethan," she wrote. "Please come home." I stared at the screen, feeling a mix of anger and sorrow. After everything they'd put me through, they had the audacity to ask for my help. I closed the email without replying. My peace was hard-won, and I wasn't about to sacrifice it for people who had never valued me. Aunt Linda, the one family member who had always been in my corner, kept me updated on their struggles. She didn't sugarcoat the reality: my parents were broke, my father's health was deteriorating, and Ryan was as irresponsible as ever. Through it all, Linda never pressured me to reconcile. "You've earned your peace," she said. "Don't let them take it from you." Now, as I sit in the home I built for myself, I reflect on everything I've endured. Walking away wasn't easy, but it was necessary. In their absence, I found clarity, strength, and self-worth. People say family is everything, but that's only true when family treats you like you matter. Mine didn't. So I chose to matter to myself. And I'll never regret that choice. The email from my mother stayed unread in my inbox for weeks. Occasionally, I would glance at it, my cursor hovering over the subject line, "We need you, Ethan." Each time, I reminded myself why I couldn't go back. After all, this was the family that had turned their backs on me during my darkest moments. Their pleas now felt hollow, a desperate attempt to patch up the fractures they had spent a lifetime creating. It was Aunt Linda who finally broke the silence. She called one evening, her voice tinged with concern. "Ethan, your father's not doing well," she began. "The doctors think his heart won't hold out much longer. Your mother's a wreck." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. "Linda, I appreciate you telling me, but I'm not sure what you want me to do. I can't just forget everything." "I'm not asking you to," she said gently. "But closure matters, Ethan. For you, not for them. Think about it." Her words stayed with me, nagging at the edges of my mind. Closure. What did that even look like? I had already closed the door on my family years ago. Reopening it felt like inviting chaos back into my life. But Linda was right about one thing: there were questions I had buried, wounds that had never fully healed. The next day, I made a decision. I wouldn't go home, but I would meet Linda. We arranged to have lunch at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, a neutral ground where I could hear her out without the weight of my childhood home looming over me. When I arrived, Linda was already seated, a steaming cup of tea in front of her. She smiled warmly, the kind of smile that had always made me feel safe. "Thanks for coming," she said as I sat down. "No problem," I replied, though my stomach churned with unease. "What's going on?" Linda took a deep breath. "Your dad's condition is serious, Ethan. He's had 2 heart episodes this month. Your mom's struggling to keep up with the bills. Ryan, well, you can imagine." I snorted. "Let me guess. He's still the same irresponsible mess he's always been." She hesitated, then nodded. "He's moved back in with your parents. Lost his last job. Again." "Of course he did," I muttered, bitterness seeping into my voice. "And they're still enabling him, aren't they?" Linda's expression softened. "They don't know how to stop, Ethan. It's all they've ever done." The conversation shifted as Linda filled me in on the details of my family's decline. My father's health had taken a steep downturn, exacerbated by the financial strain of bailing Ryan out of his endless failures. My mother was working part-time at a local grocery store to make ends meet, something she had never done before. And Ryan? He was as oblivious as ever, treating their home like a safety net he could fall back on without consequences. "They're paying for his mistakes," Linda said quietly. "And it's killing them." Her words stirred something in me, not pity, exactly, but a faint flicker of understanding. My parents had spent their lives putting Ryan on a pedestal, and now they were reaping the consequences of that choice. It wasn't my responsibility to save them, but it was hard not to feel the weight of it all. "I can't help them," I said finally. "I've worked too hard to build a life away from all of that." Linda reached across the table, placing a hand on mine. "I know, Ethan. But maybe you can help yourself." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "Carrying all this anger, this resentment, it's a heavy load," she said. "Maybe seeing them one last time, on your terms, could give you the closure you need." I left the cafe conflicted. Linda's suggestion made sense, but the thought of facing my family again felt like opening an old wound. Still, her words lingered, planting a seed of doubt that refused to fade. That night, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. There was one of my father, taken years ago at a barbecue. He was laughing, a spatula in hand, the picture of health and happiness. The man Linda described now was a shadow of that memory. It hit me then that while I had moved on, time hadn't stood still for them. They were older, weaker, more fragile. The next morning, I made a choice. I wouldn't go back to help them, but I would go back to confront them, to say the things I had kept bottled up for years. If closure was what I needed, I would take it on my own terms. I drove to my childhood home that weekend, the house looming larger than I remembered. The yard was overgrown, the paint on the shutters peeling. It was a far cry from the pristine image my parents had always maintained. I parked across the street, my heart pounding as I sat in the car, debating whether to step inside. Finally, I steeled myself and walked to the door. My mother answered, her face lighting up with surprise and relief. "Ethan," she breathed. "You came." "I'm not staying long," I said firmly, stepping past her into the foyer. The air inside was heavy, filled with a mix of nostalgia and tension. Ryan was sprawled on the couch in the living room, a video game controller in hand. He barely looked up as I entered. "Hey, bro," he said casually, as if nothing had happened. I ignored him, turning to my mother. "Where's Dad?" "He's resting," she said. "He'll be so happy to see you." "I'm not here for a reunion," I replied. "I just need to say some things." She looked taken aback but nodded, gesturing for me to sit. I remained standing, my gaze shifting to Ryan. "Do you even realize what you've done to this family?" He blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" "You," I said, my voice rising. "You've bled them dry with your selfishness. And they let you. But you've never cared, have you? You've never had to face the consequences of your actions." Ryan's expression hardened. "Don't come in here acting all high and mighty. You walked away, remember?" "Yes, I did. And it's the best decision I ever made," I shot back. "Because staying here, in this toxic mess, would have destroyed me." My mother stepped between us, her voice trembling. "Ethan, please. This isn't helping." I turned to her, my anger softening. "Mom, I'm sorry for what you're going through. I really am. But I can't fix this. Ryan has to take responsibility, and you have to let him." Before she could respond, a voice called from the hallway. "What's going on?" My father appeared, frail and unsteady. The sight of him stopped me cold. This wasn't the man I remembered, strong, commanding, larger than life. He was a shell of himself, and it broke something inside me. "Ethan," he said, his voice weak but filled with hope. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "Hi, Dad." For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of years pressing down on all of us. And in that silence, I realized Linda was right. This wasn't about them. It was about me, finally letting go of the anger that had defined so much of my life. "I needed to say goodbye," I said quietly. "To all of this." And with that, I turned and walked out the door, leaving the past behind me for good. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, memories of the confrontation played on repeat: Ryan's dismissive smirk, my father's frail frame, my mother's pleading eyes. I had expected the visit to bring closure, but instead, it left me with a strange hollowness. I had said my piece, but the emotions I'd carried for so long refused to fade. The next morning, I tried to push the encounter from my mind. Work was my refuge. I threw myself into projects, keeping my schedule packed to avoid the quiet moments when my thoughts would creep in. My team at the cybersecurity firm relied on me, and I took comfort in the sense of purpose my role provided. But even the satisfaction of a job well done couldn't silence the nagging questions. Had I been too harsh? Too distant? Or was I justified in leaving them to face the mess they had created? About a week later, Aunt Linda called again. I hesitated before answering, unsure if I wanted to hear more updates about my family. But something in me couldn't ignore her. "Ethan," she began softly, "your father's back in the hospital. It's serious this time." I felt my stomach knot. "How serious?" "The doctors don't think he has much time left," Linda admitted. "Your mother is barely holding it together. She's been sleeping in a chair by his bed. Ryan, well, Ryan is Ryan." I didn't respond immediately. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. "Do you think I should go?" I finally asked. "That's up to you," Linda said. "But if you want to say goodbye, now might be your only chance." The thought of returning to that hospital, of seeing my father in such a vulnerable state, filled me with dread. But Linda's words stuck with me. I had walked away once before, but this felt different. This wasn't about making peace with my family, it was about making peace with myself. That evening, I found myself in the hospital parking lot, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The building loomed before me, its fluorescent lights casting an eerie glow. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to get out of the car and walk through the sliding doors. The sterile smell of disinfectant hit me immediately, triggering memories of childhood trips to the ER after Ryan's various antics, a broken arm from climbing a fence, stitches from a botched skateboarding trick. My parents had always fussed over him, doting on his every whim, while I sat quietly in the corner, reading a book or doing my homework. Now, the roles were reversed. Ryan was nowhere to be seen, and I was the one stepping forward. When I reached my father's room, I paused in the doorway. He lay in the hospital bed, his face pale and gaunt, the rhythmic beeping of the monitors the only sound in the room. My mother sat by his side, her hands clutching his as if she could anchor him to life through sheer willpower. She looked up as I entered, her eyes widening in surprise. "Ethan," she whispered. "You came." I nodded, stepping inside. My father stirred at the sound of her voice, his eyes fluttering open. When he saw me, a faint smile crossed his lips. "Son," he said weakly. I swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. The man before me was a shadow of the father I had once known. His presence had always been imposing, his voice commanding. Now, he seemed so small, so fragile. "Hi, Dad," I managed, pulling up a chair beside the bed. For a moment, none of us spoke. The weight of unspoken words filled the room, pressing down on us like a physical force. Finally, my father broke the silence. I know I wasn't always fair to you," he began, his voice trembling. I made mistakes. The admission caught me off guard. My father had never been one to acknowledge his faults. Hearing those words from him felt surreal. We all made mistakes, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. But we can't go back and change them. He nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with tears. I'm proud of you, Ethan. More than I ever told you. You've built a good life for yourself. The lump in my throat grew, making it hard to speak. I had spent so many years craving those words, and now that I finally heard them, I wasn't sure how to respond. Thank you, I said simply. My mother reached over, placing a hand on mine. We're sorry for everything, she said, her voice breaking. For how we treated you. You deserved better. I looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. For the first time, I felt the faint stirrings of forgiveness. It wasn't complete, and it wouldn't come overnight, but it was a start. The hours passed in a blur as we talked quietly, sharing memories and saying the things that had gone unsaid for too long. When the nurse finally came in to check on my father, I stood to leave. Ethan, my father said, his voice barely audible. Take care of your mother. And yourself. I nodded, squeezing his hand. I will. Rest now, Dad. As I walked out of the room, I felt a strange sense of peace. The visit hadn't erased the past, but it had given me something I hadn't realized I needed, a chance to say goodbye on my terms. Closure wasn't a clean break or a perfect resolution. It was messy, complicated, and imperfect. But it was enough. In the days that followed, I returned to my life with a renewed sense of purpose. I focused on my work, my friends, and the future I was building. My family's struggles continued, but they no longer defined me. For the first time, I felt truly free. The calm didn't last long. Just as I started to feel like the weight of my family's troubles had finally lifted, a call from Aunt Linda shattered the fragile peace I had built. Ethan, I hate to bother you again, she began, her voice unusually strained. But something has happened. My pulse quickened. What is it? She hesitated, as if weighing how much to tell me. Your father, he's taken a turn for the worse. And Ryan, well, he's made things even harder. What did he do this time? I asked, unable to keep the frustration out of my voice. Linda sighed. He's emptied your parents' savings account. He told your mother he'd pay it back, but Ethan, we both know he won't. She's beside herself. And with your father, it's all too much for her. I felt the familiar surge of anger bubbling beneath the surface. Ryan's selfishness had reached a new low. Why would she let him do that? Why does she always let him get away with it? You know why, Linda said softly. Your parents, they never learned how to say no to Ryan. The news left me torn. I had worked so hard to distance myself from their chaos, to build a life where I didn't have to clean up Ryan's messes. But now, with my father's condition worsening and my mother bearing the brunt of it all, ignoring their problems felt impossible. 2 days later, I found myself back at the hospital. My father was asleep when I arrived, and my mother was sitting in a chair by the window, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. Ethan, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for coming. I sat down beside her. How is he? She shook her head. Not good. The doctors say it's only a matter of time now. We sat in silence for a moment before I asked, Mom, why did you let Ryan take the money? Tears welled up in her eyes. I don't know. I thought maybe this time he'd finally do the right thing. I wanted to believe him. I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my frustration in check. You can't keep enabling him, Mom. He's never going to change if you don't stop bailing him out. She nodded, wiping her eyes. I know you're right. But it's so hard, Ethan. He's my son. And I'm your son too, I reminded her gently. You've spent so much time trying to save Ryan that you've pushed me away in the process. Her face crumpled, and for the first time, I saw the depth of her regret. I'm so sorry, Ethan. I've failed you both in so many ways. Before I could respond, the door opened, and Ryan sauntered in, his usual air of nonchalance intact. Hey, bro, he said, flashing a grin. Didn't expect to see you here. I stood, my body tense. What are you doing here, Ryan? Visiting Dad, obviously, he replied, his tone casual. What's your problem? My problem, I said, my voice low but steady, is that you drained their savings while Dad is in the hospital. Do you have any idea what you've done? Ryan's grin faded, replaced by a defensive scowl. I told Mom I'd pay it back. It's not a big deal. It's always not a big deal with you, I snapped. You've been saying you'll fix things for years, and all you do is make them worse. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. Look, I don't need a lecture from you. You walked away, remember? You left me to deal with all of this. Deal with what? I shot back. You've done nothing but take from them. From me. I've worked for everything I have, and all you've done is leech off their kindness. Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but my mother's voice cut through the tension. Stop it, both of you, she said, her tone sharp. This isn't the time. I stepped back, my chest heaving. Ryan muttered something under his breath and left the room, slamming the door behind him. My mother sighed heavily, her shoulders slumping. I'm sorry, Ethan. I didn't mean for you to see that. I sat down again, running a hand through my hair. Mom, something has to change. He's not going to stop unless you make him. She nodded slowly, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. Years of enabling Ryan had left her trapped in a cycle she didn't know how to break. The next morning, my father woke briefly, his voice weak but clear. Ethan, he said, reaching for my hand. Take care of your mother. Tears blurred my vision as I nodded. I will, Dad. He passed away that afternoon, surrounded by the family he had tried so hard to hold together. As I watched my mother grieve, I realized that the weight of responsibility had shifted. Ryan would never step up, and Aunt Linda couldn't shoulder the burden alone. If anything was going to change, it would be up to me to set the boundaries my parents never could. The funeral was small, attended by close family and a few of my father's old friends. Ryan showed up late, his shirt wrinkled and his demeanor flippant. I avoided him, focusing instead on supporting my mother. After the service, as everyone began to leave, Ryan approached me. Ethan, he said, his tone unusually subdued. Can we talk? I crossed my arms, wary. What is it, Ryan? He hesitated, shoving his hands into his pockets. I screwed up. With the money, with everything. I know I've been a mess, but I want to fix things. I want to be better. For a moment, I considered his words. Part of me wanted to believe him, to hope that he could change. But the years of disappointment weighed heavily on my heart. That's up to you, Ryan, I said finally. But I can't keep cleaning up your messes. If you want to fix things, you need to start by taking responsibility. He nodded, his expression unreadable. I will. As he walked away, I felt a glimmer of hope tempered by caution. Ryan's words were a start, but only time would tell if he meant them. In the meantime, I knew I had to focus on my own life, my own peace. For too long, I had been defined by my family's chaos. Now, it was time to define myself. The weeks after the funeral were a strange mix of quiet and turbulence. On the surface, life returned to normal. Work projects consumed my days, and I spent evenings catching up with friends or reading books that had sat on my shelf for far too long. But underneath, there was a simmering unease, a constant replay of my father's last words: "Take care of your mother." I visited her regularly, helping with errands and fixing things around the house. Each visit brought its own set of challenges. My mother was struggling, not just with grief but with the weight of years spent in Ryan's shadow. She'd always been strong in her own way, but now that strength seemed brittle. It was as though losing my father had finally exposed all the cracks in her armor. Ryan's promises, unsurprisingly, amounted to nothing. He continued to drift in and out of my mother's life, showing up with excuses instead of solutions. One evening, after I'd replaced the broken lock on her front door, she turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Ethan, I don't know how to make him stop," she confessed. "I don't know how to let go." Her vulnerability caught me off guard. For so long, I'd seen her as complicit in Ryan's behavior, an enabler who refused to hold him accountable. But now I saw the truth: she was as much a victim of his manipulation as anyone else. "Mom, you don't have to fix Ryan," I said gently. "You've done everything you could for him. It's time to take care of yourself." She nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. Change wouldn't come easily. Decades of habits don't break overnight, and the ties that bind families are often the hardest to sever. A few days later, I received a call from Ryan. His name flashing on my phone filled me with dread, but curiosity got the better of me. "Ethan," he began, his tone subdued. "I know I've messed up. I'm trying to get things together, but I need help. Just one more chance." I took a deep breath, my grip tightening on the phone. "Ryan, I've given you more chances than I can count. So has Mom. You need to figure this out on your own." "You don't get it," he said, his voice rising. "I'm trying. I'm not like you. I don't have everything figured out." His words stung, not because they were true, but because they reflected the excuse he had clung to his entire life. "Ryan, you're not supposed to have it all figured out," I replied. "But you are supposed to try. And trying doesn't mean taking from others. It means standing on your own 2 feet. Until you're ready to do that, there's nothing I can do for you." The line went silent for a moment before he muttered, "Thanks for nothing." Then he hung up. The conversation left me shaken but resolute. I'd spent years cleaning up after Ryan, but this time was different. This time, I was choosing myself. That choice became even clearer when Aunt Linda invited me over for dinner a week later. As we sat on her back porch, the sun setting behind her garden, she handed me a small box. "Your father wanted you to have this," she said. I opened it to find an old pocket watch, its surface worn but polished. Inside was a note in my father's handwriting: "Ethan, you were always my steady hand. I'm sorry I didn't tell you that enough. Keep moving forward." The weight of the watch in my hand felt both heavy and comforting. For so long, I'd carried the burden of feeling unseen, unappreciated. And now, even in death, my father had given me the validation I'd craved for years. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was enough to remind me that I mattered. As I left Linda's that evening, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. My family's chaos had shaped me, yes, but it hadn't defined me. The anger, the resentment, the disappointment, they had all been necessary steps in finding my own strength. But they weren't who I was anymore. The next time Ryan called, I didn't answer. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my relationship with my mother, helping her find moments of peace amidst the storm. I encouraged her to join a local support group, to rediscover the hobbies she'd abandoned years ago. Slowly, I watched her come back to life, her laughter becoming less rare, her smile less forced. As for me, I continued to move forward. I threw myself into my work, building a team that felt like a second family. I traveled to places I'd always dreamed of visiting, meeting people who reminded me how vast and beautiful the world could be. And in those moments, I realized something profound: freedom isn't the absence of responsibility, it's the presence of choice. For the first time, I was choosing to live for myself. Ryan's shadow still lingered at the edges of my life, but it no longer consumed me. Whether he found his way or not was out of my control. What mattered was that I had finally found mine. Looking back, the lessons my family taught me weren't the ones they intended. They taught me the value of boundaries, the importance of self-worth, and the courage it takes to walk away from what no longer serves you. Those lessons weren't easy, but they were worth it. As I stand here now, holding my father's pocket watch, I feel a sense of clarity I never thought possible. Life is messy, complicated, and imperfect. But it's also filled with moments of beauty, redemption, and hope. And for the first time, I'm ready to embrace it all.